Debt has become a huge problem in our country. Some economists are dismissing it. Most Americans, and some very important economists, see it as a terrible threat on our horizon. That and more today on The Gary DeMar Show. Hello and welcome today to the Gary DeMar Show. I'm your host, Joel McDurmon, and I would like to read a little scripture concerning the issue of economic scheming. This comes from the prophet Micah, beginning in the 2nd chapter. Woe to those who scheme iniquity, who work out evil on their beds. When morning comes, they do it, for it is in the power of their hands. They covet fields and then seize them, and houses, and they take them away. They rob a man and his house, a man and his inheritance. And if you skip on down and read through chapter 3, you'll realize that he's talking to the rulers of the nation at the time, and he's calling them out for scheming, robbing, and coveting. And really, if you put those in order, it is coveting, scheming, and robbing. Somebody covets your property, your inheritance, your land, your income. They find a way to scheme. And this is where the greatest part of the sin enters into society, is the scheming, finding a way to take that and appropriate it from someone else, and then executing the scheme, which is the robbing. Terrible problem in our nation. It has led to $14 trillion national debt, and we're piling on at the rate of $1.8 to $2 trillion a year now, which is unprecedented. We just heard a news story yesterday that we spent 40-something billion in January alone and about 90-something billion in last December alone, and we're on pace now to have another record deficit year. Just less than a month ago, President Obama, in his State of the Union address, tried to alleviate these fears among the American people, saying that this, starting in 2011, notice how we're already kicking the can down to next year. Oh, I'll quit drinking someday. I'll get there. I'll eventually do it. But tonight, let's party on. We are prepared to freeze government spending for 3 years. We've already identified $20 billion in savings for the next year. Blah, blah, blah. And he goes on for more plans. Of course, it didn't take long for the news to get out that, well, what he's really talking about is not touching Medicare, not touching Medicaid or Social Security, the great behemoths that are sagging our national debt, national debt too, and also not going to touch national defense spending, but all other discretionary forms of spending, those we're going to shave off. They're going to give a haircut in those places. And of course, it didn't take long at all for the news to get out that that only counts for about 17% of the budget. And when the overall budget is already sagging $2 trillion a year, to save $20 billion is less than, or is barely 1%. Now let me ask you a question. How much of a percentage of your income has this recession taken a toll on? In other words, how much have you had to cut back because of the economy and the state of the economy today? Has it been 5%, maybe 10, maybe even 20? In some cases, maybe you've been among the unemployed, running at 10%, which is a false number because it doesn't count those who are not looking for work. It's probably over 20% actually. If you're among that number of people, or the underemployed, you've probably had to cut back more than 20%, maybe even as much as, who knows, maybe 50%, maybe more. How much have you had to cut back? Well, our government, who is addicted to debt, to deficit spending for pet projects, for political muscle, has committed, thanks to our fearless leader, to cutting back barely 1%. Oh, yes, we know we're borrowing at rates of trillions, so instead of borrowing $220 trillion next year, we'll just borrow, or I should say $2.2 trillion next year, we'll just borrow $2 trillion even. And that will be savings, according to the liberal mindset. Covet, scheme, and rob. And of course, the best way to keep doing that is to keep inflating the amount of money that you borrow And if people get mad about it, say, oh, well, I won't borrow as much. You know, the problem is an addiction. The problem is a terrible addiction. There is a perfect analogy, I would say, between debt financing and an addiction to a drug. The cure for getting off of an addiction is not to cut back a little bit. It is to go cold turkey, go through the pains, go through the support it takes to go through rehab, okay? And in rehab, you're not allowed to have just a little bit less of the drugs you were taking. You're allowed to have none of it. And you have to bear the sacrifice and the pain of going through it. On tomorrow's show, I'll talk about some other numbers and some other shady ways of scheming, or at least one particular very suspicious way of scheming that has come up recently. And we'll talk a little bit more about this deal about coveting, scheming, and robbing. If you'd like to see a full presentation of this, here's a talk I gave at last year's conference. It's called Protecting Your Wealth from Liberal Fallacies. And I go into national debt, I go into what fallacies are, how they apply to economics, how it applies to biblical law, and then I show you the national debt and how it's ballooned over the years and how people in the media are calling for this as a good thing. And we'll talk a little bit about this more tomorrow on tomorrow's show. Thank you for joining me on the Gary DeMar Show. See you next time.
For more related to today's topic, check out Protecting Your Wealth from Liberal Fallacies, featuring Joel McDurmon. You will find it at AmericanVision.com.
Debt. That's the show. That's a wrap. Let's go home.